For 2,000 years, the story of the Amazon warriors was considered one of the great myths of the ancient world. Greek writers described a society of women who lived on the Pontic steppe, north of the Black Sea. They rode horses. They carried iron swords and bows. They fought in battles against armies of men. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, said that no Sarmatian woman could marry until she had killed an enemy in combat. Modern historians dismissed all of it. The Amazons, they said, were a fantasy invented by Greek men to explore anxieties about gender and power. The warrior women were a literary device, a myth, the kind of story that ancient cultures told about the edges of the known world, where anything was possible because nobody could check. In 2019, ancient DNA extracted from burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe ended that debate. The warrior women were real. The graves were there the whole time. We just assumed we knew who was in them. The archaeological record of the Eurasian steppe is dominated by burial mounds called kurgans. These were the graves of the Scythian and Sarmatian peoples, nomadic pastoralists who occupied the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea from roughly 700 BC to 200 AD. They herded cattle and horses. They traded across enormous distances. They fought. And when they died, they were buried under mounds of earth that have survived for 2,500 years. For most of the 20th century, whenever archaeologists excavated a kurgan and found weapons alongside the remains, they assumed the burial was male. The logic was straightforward. Warriors were men. Weapons meant warrior, therefore male. This assumption was so embedded in the field that it was often applied without explicit discussion. The grave goods said warrior. The analysis said male. Done. When the skeletal remains were examined more carefully, something began to look wrong. Some of the individuals buried with weapons had narrow pelvises, small bones, and skull morphology associated with female anatomy. But the assumption was resilient. The grave goods must have been mixed up. The bone analysis must be inconclusive. The category of female warrior was too dissonant with the established model to be accepted on skeletal evidence alone. Ancient DNA does not have assumptions. It reads, what is there? And when researchers began extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from weapon-bearing Scythian and Sarmatian burials, the results forced a complete revision of how this culture had been understood for over a century. A major ancient DNA study published in 2019 analyzed hundreds of individuals from Scythian and Sarmatian burial sites across the Eurasian steppe, spanning nearly 1,000 years of steppe history. The DNA confirmed biological sex unambiguously, and among the individuals buried with weapons, a significant number were female. Not one or two anomalies that could be explained away. Across multiple sites, across multiple centuries, women were being buried in warrior graves in numbers that changed the picture entirely. Earlier estimates from skeletal analysis had suggested something like 20% of warrior burials might be female. The DNA confirmed those estimates and extended them. In some site clusters, the proportion of weapon-bearing female burials ran higher still. The DNA told more than just biological sex. The skeletal remains of these women showed the bone deformities that develop in people who ride horses from early childhood. Changes to the hip socket, the lower spine, the knee joints. These are not injuries, they are adaptations. The kind of physical remodeling that happens over years and years of a body adjusting to the demands of horsemanship. These women had not been buried with weapons as a symbolic honor after peaceful lives. They had spent their lives on horseback. Their skeletons were the record. One of the most documented individual cases came from a burial near Pokrovka in southern Russia. A girl, 13 or 14 years old, found in a full warrior burial. Iron dagger, bronze arrowheads, a horse sacrifice in the grave alongside her. DNA confirmed she was female. Her age means she had been riding and training since she was small. She was not old enough to have lived a long warrior life. She had simply always been in training for one, and she died before she could complete it. In another burial, a woman in her 40s was found with a bronze mirror alongside a complete set of weapons and the healed bone injuries of someone who had survived combat. The fractures that had knitted back together. The joint damage of repeated physical stress. Her body was a record of a life spent fighting. The mirror was not a contradiction. It was the same person. The geography of these burials is not a coincidence. The weapon-bearing female graves cluster in the region directly north of the Black Sea, across the Pontic steppe into the southern Ural Mountains. This is precisely the territory that Herodotus identified as the homeland of the Amazons when he wrote about them in the 5th century BC. He was not writing about a distant mythological realm. He was describing, with reasonable accuracy, a real population that Greek traders and travelers had encountered and returned home to report on. The Greeks called them Amazons. The Scythians and Sarmatians had their own internal social structures that we can only partially reconstruct. But the external account and the archaeological and genetic record now align more closely than anyone expected when ancient DNA research began. There were women on the steppe who fought. They trained from childhood. They rode horses. They carried weapons into conflict. Some died in combat. Some survived long enough to grow old, and their aged bodies still carried the healed damage of the violence they had lived through. The DNA also placed these women genetically within the broader Scythian and Sarmatian populations. They belonged to the same haplogroups as the male burials around them. They were not a separate caste or a distinct group. They were Scythian women, raised in a culture that made space for female warriors in a way that had no parallel in the ancient Mediterranean world that was writing about them. The Yamnaya pastoralists who had expanded across the steppe 5,000 years earlier were the genetic ancestors of these populations. The same migration that brought height genes and lactase persistence into northwestern Europe also seeded the steppe cultures that would eventually produce the women whose graves the Greeks turned into mythology. The warrior women of the Pontic steppe were the genetic descendants of the same population that reshaped the DNA of Europe. The Amazon myth did not originate in the imagination of Greek men. It originated in contact. Greek merchants, colonists, and travelers operating around the Black Sea encountered Scythian and Sarmatian communities and observed women who were unlike anything in the Greek world. Women who rode horses, women who carried weapons, women who fought. They brought those accounts home, and Greek writers shaped them into a mythology that lasted millennia. The Amazons appear in the myths of Heracles, Achilles, and Theseus. They appear on temple friezes and painted pottery across the Greek world. They became one of the enduring images of ancient culture, repeated and reinterpreted across 2,000 years of Western tradition. All of it traces back to real women, real graves, real bones that still carry the DNA record of who they were. There is a specific detail from these burials worth sitting with. Some of the women found in warrior graves were also found with evidence of having given birth, children buried nearby. The warrior identity and the maternal identity were not in opposition. These were women who did both. The Greek mythological Amazon cut herself off from men and motherhood to become a warrior. The archaeological and genetic record shows something more human and more complex. Women who raised children. Women who trained those children to ride. Women who fought and were honored for it and were buried as warriors when they died. The myth said the Amazons were the opposite of ordinary women. The DNA says they were ordinary women in a culture that defined ordinary differently. The full extent of female warrior participation in steppe cultures is still being mapped. The studies published so far have covered major burial site clusters, but the Scythian and Sarmatian world extended across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Each new excavation and each new ancient DNA study adds resolution to a picture that is still incomplete. There is also the question of other ancient cultures. The steppe case is the most extensively studied because of the Greek mythological connection, but female warrior and leadership burials have been identified elsewhere. The Lady of Chao, a Moche warrior ruler buried in Peru around 400 AD, was found with weapons, sacrificial victims, and all the markers of supreme military and political authority. DNA confirmed she was female. The assumptions about male default leadership in that culture had obscured her for over 1,000 years after her burial. The pattern that ancient DNA is revealing, slowly and site by site, is that female participation in warfare, leadership, and high-status roles in ancient societies was more widespread than the historical record has acknowledged. The historical record was written overwhelmingly by men from cultures where these roles were not available to women. The DNA is not bound by those assumptions. It reads what was actually there. How widespread the pattern actually was and what it means for how we understand the ancient world is still being worked out. The kurgans are still being excavated. The DNA is still being extracted. Each burial is a case file that was sealed 2,000 years ago and is only now being opened. The Amazons were real, not a myth, not propaganda, not a literary device for exploring Greek anxieties about gender. Real women on the Pontic steppe, who rode horses since childhood, carried iron weapons, fought in conflicts, survived combat or did not, and were buried with the same honor as the warriors they fought alongside. Herodotus described them in the 5th century BC. Archaeologists excavated their graves for 100 years without recognizing them, because the assumption that warriors were male was stronger than the evidence in front of them. Ancient DNA removed the assumption and left only the evidence. The myth was not wrong. The assumptions that dismissed it were. If you carry Yamnaya ancestry, which means if you have significant European, South Asian, or Central Asian heritage, then somewhere deep in your family tree there were people from the same steppe populations that produced these women. The culture that buried female warriors with iron swords and horse sacrifices is part of the same genetic story as the culture that brought height genes into the Netherlands and blue eyes into Scandinavia. The graves are still being found. The DNA is still being read. Each one gives back a name that history forgot to record, and a body that tells the story history did not know to tell. The case is confirmed. The myth was the evidence all along.